Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Wednesday, October 15th, 2025. We're going to be looking into the easiest and most realistic way the Democrats can take back the U.S. Senate, not basically trying to do how quickly things could go and assuming good management, assuming just a few things, but the most likely way that if they try to fight for it, they could win back the Senate. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, be sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X, as well as visit our website, electiontimene.ws, linked in the description below for news feeds and our latest predictions. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, obviously, the 2024 election was very rough for the Democrats. They would have only needed to have lost West Virginia, which was basically completely certain, um, in order to lose the entire control of the Senate with J.D. Vance in the White House. But then they lost three more, so 53-47, which means that the Democrats need four seats to take control of the chamber, or they could have, in theory, effectual control with Dan Osborne if he does end up flipping that seat. But here's what we're looking at so far for projections. So that's just what we're looking at so far. So it's looking very rough. There need to be four seats flipped, and that's just generally over time. There's also a rough map for the upcoming elections as well, as there are a lot of seats that are held by Republicans in this that aren't necessarily that competitive. Now, races that are expected to be competitive, which is just under 12 points, are the races as follows, and so that's going to be the only real field that they could potentially end up getting, and Nebraska's with an independent, so that doesn't really count. So there are 11 competitive races, but most of them are going to be on the higher end, especially Mississippi and Kansas are basically going to be around 9 points, so they're not going to compete in those. So those are off the table. That's not actually there, that's for an independent. And so South Carolina, Jamie Harrison lost by a bit, but that was after having the highest raising the most money for a Senate candidate to the time, still lost by 10.3, so they're not going to focus there at all. So, with 7 races left, they're not going to focus on Florida after the final 2024 disaster, where they did finally invest a bit in McChrystal Powell for to lose by 13. So, you're ended up now with 6. And that's not leaving you much room for error here. So, this is the issue with the Democrats' map in 2026. So that's why they are very unlikely to win control of the Senate. So that's how things got left off after 2024. But now let's look up at how 2026 could go. So this is going to be the build-up essentially for potentially taking control in 2028. So this is the map right now currently, and out of these competitive races, you're going to be looking at, didn't mean to get that one. Out of these competitive races, a little bit. Out of these competitive races, you're going to be trying to have the Democrats pick off a few. Not necessarily sure about Minnesota, depends on how the primary goes. Out of these races, 46, 44, you're going to want to have the Democrats pick up at least 7 of them, which is going to be difficult, or at least 6 if Nebraska goes for Osborne. But Republicans are probably going to be able to hold on in Texas. That's probably going to be just under 12. That might be a bit close. We're probably going to hold on. Same thing in Alaska. Even if it is Mary Peltola, they could potentially get closer, but still. Nebraska, Dan Osborne's a very strong candidate, but so is Pete Ricketts. He was a very popular governor for a while. They don't have even a Rob Sand equivalent in the Senate level, so likely to go red in Iowa, and that's enough for Republicans to retain control, which means that they're just building up for the next one. Michigan is probably going to go a bit somewhat strongly potentially, but nothing huge. It's probably going to go by over 12. New Mexico is probably not. New Hampshire probably going to be relatively good performance for Chris Pappas. Ohio. Now, this would be one where the Democrats would absolutely push for flipping it, would be in Ohio. Sherrod Brown potentially being able to take back that seat. That would be a very difficult push. but that absolutely is possible. That would be one of the main races that they would have to push for. But the other ones would be holding on in Georgia with John Ossoff, 48 for the Democrats, flipping Maine against Susan Collins, a chronic overperformer there, won by 8.5 on the same ballot that Joe Biden won the state by 9, 17 points of split ticketing right there in her favor. So that's going to be very difficult for Democrats to be able to pull things together for. And then in North Carolina, you end up with Roy Cooper potentially being able to flip that, and then it would be 50-50 in the Senate. So that would be a very strong performance for the Democrats being able to flip Ohio, which would set them up very well for 2028, because this is going to be the main concern here is going to be in 2028. So in 2028, in order to win control, at this point, they have 34-34, and it's 50-50. So if we get rid of this, at this point, it is 50-50 in the Senate. So I actually shouldn't have gotten rid of that. So this is current control of each seat in the Senate in this cycle. And so Democrats are going to have to build off of that in order to be able to take control of the chamber. And so that's going to be the main challenge there. Is it's actually 34-34, but it should be 50-50. So get each up to 50 here. That means that there are 35 incumbent seats there for the Republicans, 31 for the Republicans, 35 for the Democrats. But there's more Republicans here, but that's where the Democrats can pick these races off. So things off, West Coast should be able to be locked down well. Colorado, that's going to be with Bennett. I believe he actually is retiring to run for governor, but still it's going to be relatively strong. Hawaii, it's Hawaii. Illinois, no problem with Duckworth. Probably going to be able to easily win another cycle. New York, even if Schumer gets primaried, we could probably get end up winning by a good bit. Now, the fact it was 14 in 2022 is a bit concerning, but still. Vermont, it's basically Vermont. Welch going to win by a lot again. Blumenthal probably going to be okay. The entire Northeast area. Maryland not going to be of any concern to the Democrats, so they're going to have at least 45. Republicans are not going to have any issues in any of their main states. Kansas, this is the better candidate of the two. Utah, Kentucky, Indiana, South Carolina, Alabama. Florida at this point is going to be basically locked down, and this is going to be whoever ends up taking over for Rubio at this point. So probably Ashley Moody being able to be reelected by over 12. And then Alaska is going to potentially be Murkowski. We'll have to see how things go there, but that's going to be a bit tentative. So here potentially are the competitive races in 2028. North Carolina continuing to trend to the left. Warnock's definitely going to be favored in Georgia to start things off because he has extremely strong black support. The state is continuing to trend to the left very strongly, and it will continue to do so by 2028. So that's going to be the main thing that's going for them there, is going to be that strong support continuing in their direction. Pennsylvania, this is going to get complicated with John Fetterman. We're going to have to see if he ends up actually surviving a potential primary challenge from some Democrats. There's nothing on it yet, but it's very high Republican approval. So if he actually ends up staying as is, he could potentially win by over 6 points. But if he ends up losing the primary and potentially doing anything, then this is definitely going to be a more competitive race. But that really does depend on how well he ends up doing the primary. So right now it's going to be lean state. Nevada continuing to trend to the right. This might be Masto's final cycle. Depends on how well Democrats do in the state on the presidential level. But as of right now, honestly, I would probably put it in the tilt red category. But luckily for Democrats, it actually doesn't matter as of right now, even though they would lose that seat. Kelly probably would be narrowly favored. He's relatively popular. The state is actually slightly trending to the left. 2024 basically completely put the brakes on it, but it still does somewhat have that trajectory. There's still that gravity moving, so while it stopped temporarily, it would slowly start sliding in that direction again if I did have to guess. Ted Budd isn't necessarily extremely popular, and he only won by 3.2% in 2022, which was a relatively strong year for the Democrats. That's 0.1% popular vote win. That's going to be 3.3 points to the 3.1 points to the right of the nation. incumbent, so would be narrowly favored there, but potentially being able to see some motion there. But here's what's really going to matter is New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan potentially being able to win by over 12. Wisconsin, Johnson definitely being weaker. Tony Evers probably isn't going to run, but still could potentially be a relatively interesting one. This is going to be a number one target here. If the Democrats can't pick off, um, assuming they could with Sherrod Brown here, he'd probably end up getting reelected at this point, which means that they would take control of the Senate even without the presidency. So that would be something interesting to see there. This would be Sherrod Brown's seat, and see it is J.D. Vance's here. That's for the final 2 years of the term. If Sherrod Brown does win election here, then he might be able to pull it off and potentially win very narrowly. Now this would be a presidential year electorate. So there's going to be a lot more Republicans showing out. He'd need to definitely strengthen his support that he had seen more in the 2018 era than he had been seeing recently, or potentially just end up having strong enough Democratic turnout still, even in a presidential year. And then they potentially be able to pull off a win, or Republicans would probably be able to win again in Iowa. This would be Grassley, been in the Senate for a very, very long time, potentially may retire, but if he doesn't, it's going to be a safe seat. So that's probably the best way for them to be able to win the Senate. It would probably be a lot easier if they end up holding on to Nevada, because Brown could definitely go down after 2 years, considering the fact that it's again going to be another presidential election cycle, and we saw how that went for him there. Even though he did very, very well, he overperformed Kamala Harris by 9 points, but still, if you assume that Ohio is probably going to be close-ish to where it was, and even if it shifts a point to the left in respect to the nation, and the nation shifts 5 points to the left, then Brown would narrowly be holding on. So that is still definitely going to be a main concern there, but if they end up holding on either in Nevada or Ohio, then you end up picking one or the other, and they could potentially end up holding on to the Senate. So that's going to be the main thing for the Democratic Party. If they end up getting both, that'd be phenomenal. Potentially even picking up North Carolina, but then you could potentially end up getting nothing and looking more like a 2020 era where they were looking at North Carolina as the main pickup opportunity there, and they ended up losing to Tillis, mostly because of the issues that Cunningham had as a candidate. So that's going to be the main way that the Democrats are probably going to have to focus on winning the Senate. Now, if they do somehow manage to pull it off of this cycle with potentially pulling off a surprise win in Texas with James Tallarico, if Ken Paxton ends up winning the primary, then you're probably going to look at more margins like this in some other regions. Now, definitely make things interesting if, it does end up being it's gonna definitely end up being a completely different game here if they do end up somehow getting that one extra seat, because then you have a Democratic seat in Texas, which is insane, but that would definitely increase your chances here, potentially in North Carolina. Depends on what sort of things happen in the Senate, though, that would just make their rankings up a bit higher. That would just flip one each here, right? So that would just, it would be 53-47, so that doesn't change anything huge. They just have control of the Senate, obviously, a bit earlier, be able to block more bills from being passed. No, not restitution, reconciliation bills would be able to get passed because the Democrats would have the majority there. So that would definitely be something interesting. If Mary Peltola potentially gets that one off, then that would be very, very interesting. Murkowski potentially being able to get out there, but still, that would actually even provide insurance so they could even lose both of these races, and they would still have control of the Senate. Now, if they lost Wisconsin, then they'd need to win the presidency. But, that wouldn't necessarily be insanely surprising considering how well Ron Johnson does, even in these very competitive. Well, he knows what he's doing in Wisconsin, potentially losing in Pennsylvania, considering how poorly Democrats have done there recently. No one really expected Dave McCormick to lose. But, yeah, so there's a lot potentially that could still happen here, but Democrats could potentially get themselves on the right footing here in 2026 if they can get their game together, potentially tie up the Senate a bit, and then they would be off to potentially winning a strong amount in the Senate in 2026, along with potentially the presidency if we end up continuing having the anti-incumbency era that we've been seeing so far. So that's basically the main picture. This is a relatively shorter one. It's just a bit of a quick informational, not necessarily in depth. But because of how the Senate is staggered, it's definitely going to be more difficult for the Democrats to be able to get anything done for winning the Senate in 2026. So that makes things a bit more complicated. But that is about it. Thank you all so much for watching today's quick video. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already, and thank you, and have a fantastic rest of your day.